Thank you. So thank you for that welcome, Sage, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'd like to also acknowledge the First Nations people. I'm in Ugambi country, right on the border of the Ungalang Nation here, right on the border of New South Wales and Queensland. In fact, from my window, I can see New South Wales and Queensland. I bet nobody else here can actually do that. And I'm so very grateful that I can actually travel over to New South Wales, which I've been doing every opportunity. So I live right on the border and my heart's actually over New South Wales. So it's nice connecting the body and the heart. So in this brief presentation, I'm going to argue that mental health services are permeated by outdated, unhelpful and pathologizing discourses, which are actually antithetical to genuinely trauma-informed care. So these discourses support antiquated and largely unhelpful models of service delivery. What research on approaches to trauma informs us is that treatment for trauma is not medicine or medicines, more beds, assessment or diagnosis. The treatment beyond prevention is actually psychotherapy. So I should probably apologise that I'm actually breaching the protocols here by promoting and advocating for something that's really, really close to my heart, the valuing of genuine psychotherapeutic help. So what would our service models look like if we shifted the discourse to a psychotherapeutic one? Now, I should explain what I mean by discourse, because it's not just simply the words that we used. When there was a shift to calling people consumers from the old term patients, it didn't suddenly change the relationship that consumers or service users had with mental health services. We just changed the words. So the discourse is what underpins, our understandings. It's about meaning. It's about how we think about people, how we think about things, how we organise our social organisations and our relationships, and it's way more than words. So if we were to shift our discourse to one which around psychotherapy or psychotherapeutic encounters, how would things look different if our purpose was reframed as determining the right psychotherapeutic approach and delivering the right dose by the right person or right team at the right time? So if I could have the next slide. So this current system that we're in at the moment privileges antiquated models of care which haven't changed for decades, or not, at least not the few decades that I've been working in the field. These are by and large medico-centric rather than person-centric. They're risk-obsessed and increasingly protocol-driven. That is, the computer dictates how one should do one's work. This is something that's coming to you in New South Wales very soon, if it's not there already. Believe me, from somebody on this side of the border. It relegates most clinicians to being little more than cogs in a machine. Now, that would be absolutely fine if the output of this was improved mental health or even effective treatment for so-called serious mental illness, but it isn't. And all of the inquiries that we've had, I think 33 inquiries, we've got another one in Queensland now into our mental health system and what's wrong with it. All of these testify to the fact that our systems are not really working. They're not working for the people that are accessing assistance. They might be working for some of us. And this system actually creates chronicity. It blames the patient and their family for being treatment resistant when they don't get better, even though most people are not even offered the treatment in most instances. And I'm wondering at this point whether people might actually just enter words or phrases in the chat box. I won't be able to monitor them myself around, that they think represent the dominant discourse. Certainly, when I was working in the emergency departments recently, it was all about risk assessment and, and follow up and referral, etc. But your roles, how would you describe your roles? You could almost take these words from your role descriptions or the way other people would actually describe your role. So that's brilliant. I am seeing some of these coming up, and some of these words are rich, ripe, and probably highly accurate. Too accurate for me to actually share. So if I can have the next slide. Trauma is the underpinning issue for most people who present seeking help. Now, the treatment for trauma is not medicine. It never has been, and that isn't for want of trying. Medicine and quick fixes have been extensively explored, and there is no medical treatment for trauma. Psychotherapy is the treatment. However, state services don't generally offer psychotherapy, at least in adult services, and neither do federal programs such as Better Access. So people are encouraged or forced to be assessed and receive what passes for treatment, and their problems are rarely resolved. For many clinicians, service users, and families, encounters with the mental health system are a lot like Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over again, and very little changes. So we don't need to just change the words that we use, to trauma-informed, to recovery-orientated, and so on. In fact, changing the wording is much less important than changing the discourse, this orientation towards psychotherapeutic understanding and practice. The next slide, please. So I was asked to briefly explain what I meant by psychotherapy. So for our purposes today, psychotherapy is the purposeful use of primarily psychological tools in the context of an interpersonal relationship to help solve problems. It is the antidote to Groundhog Day in lots of ways, in which patterns are repeated over and over again. It is the experience of difference that makes a difference. And that's something I borrowed from a fellow by the name of Gregory Bateson. It's a family therapy sort of phrase that's used. So, often we don't know how our interventions are going to play out, but if the same thing's occurring over and over again, we need to introduce something different. And that hopefully that something different is going to be the thing that makes a difference to people. It's a different experience of relationship. It's communicated empathy, warmth, congruence, a non-judgmental stance, and unconditional regard. These kind of experiences being in relationship for some people, and particularly people with an experience of trauma, are new. These are the experience of being in a relationship where somebody demonstrates unconditional positive regard can be a life-changing experience. It's also the attention to building an alliance and a sense of safety, feeling respected, valued, contained, cared for, and protected in that relationship. How many service users in state, health services would say that they feel respected, valued, contained, and cared for in the web of relationships they find themselves in? So that at the right time and in the right context of a safe relationship, past experiences can be processed, new understandings and insights can emerge. So good psychotherapy or psychotherapeutic approach recognizes that fools don't rush in. They don't rush in and try and change things. You don't start processing past trauma or even delving too deeply without making sure that you've got the right conditions to do that safely. So next slide, please. So let's begin this thought experiment and imagine changing the discourse of psychiatric services to a psychotherapeutic one. And let's take as a guide Babette Rothschild's Foundations for Safe Trauma Therapy. So this arises from some famous work by this social worker who's really world famous for her work on trauma therapy, and has written a brilliant book called Trauma Essentials. It's very, very accessible. And let's argue that every interaction ought to play a part in facilitating treatment for trauma. So whilst the words we use are important, changing the discourse is not just about changing the words. We can still use words like treatment and stabilization, but what if that treatment is psychotherapy? So my awareness of a need for a radical shift around the need for a change of discourse came rather paradoxically from working in the homeless sector. So I briefly led a mental health outreach team to homeless people in North Queensland, and our highly paid team of experts would drive around, ingratiate ourselves with people sleeping rough by giving them things they valued. That was a really good thing to do. And we were delivering Pally half-year Peridone or whatever was the most expensive depot on offer. And, you know, at the time, I think it was Risperdal Consta, and it was valued, I think, at about $600 or $700 a dose. So we were delivering the most expensive depot on offer to those diagnosed with psychotic illness who were struggling to pay the rent. We couldn't get 1 cent to assist people into housing. What was truly amazing, though, and for me it was a bit of an epiphany, was that when we did find secure housing for people, the manifestations of mental illness diminished to the point where some could be undiagnosed. And I later went to Ireland and I worked with the Homeless Agency, which centrally funds shelters, soup kitchens, boarding houses, and health services for Dublin's homeless population. And they estimated that they were spending 400,000 Australian dollars, or the equivalent in euro, per year on each homeless person. So that's what a terrible waste of money. So what we did is we developed a case management program of study, which every homeless sector worker needed to complete. We shifted the aim of every encounter to getting secure housing for people. Anyone who was homeless for more than 6 months was a service failure, and an ongoing expensive one at that. Anyone who develops chronicity in mental health services ought to be considered a service failure as well. And it should be the central purpose of any and all mental health services to facilitate the right form of psychotherapeutic response at the right time. The first step and prerequisite to being psychotherapeutic is to ensure that people's physiological and safety needs are met. So if I could have the next slide, that would be great. So stabilization of basic needs must occur first. And again, my belated epiphany around this came when I was facilitating a high fidelity DBT program where we felt an enormous pressure, an internal pull to accept homeless young people into the program because it was the only evidence-based program going. And we should have slowed down and facilitated basic needs first and achieved some kind of stabilization before rushing in and expecting a young person with no home to engage enthusiastically in a program when they had no safe place to sleep. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Indeed, slowing down and resourcing and equipping people is what is supposed to happen in DBT programs. But well-meaning psychotherapists actually often want to get people or rush people into where they consider the working phase of therapy is, be that a skills group or processing traumatic memories, and so on. So next slide, please. When I was in the emergency department, I still salivate seeing this slide. Sandwiches lubricated many a productive encounter that didn't start out well. So, you know, what I learned there is that you could really disarm people by meeting some basic needs. The hospital sandwiches, which we were not allowed to actually access, were fantastic. And, you know, when people were hungry and they were waiting for a long period of time and they were thirsty, meeting those basic needs should just be obvious. When someone comes to my house, I would offer you something to eat and a cup of tea or some other lubricating beverage. And you know, meeting these basic needs is you know, one of the first things that we should consider. What does a person need right now, and what do they need to address their broader problems, not just the symptoms of their presenting problems? So all trauma treatment is or ought to be phase-based. So that is, you address basic needs first, you stabilize or equip people with the resources to tolerate distress and to build that alliance. So now to my final slide. So now to do some creative imagining, and this is what I'm really looking forward to. What if we were to shift the discourse away from assessment, referrals, beds, medicine, and towards a psychotherapeutic one? And this needn't apply to just those with clear-cut trauma histories. The first line approach to just about everything is some form of psychotherapy. And many people don't get the right dose of psychotherapy or lifestyle prescription before they're offered a pill. And this is the very issue that was raised quite forcefully by the NICE guidelines on mood disorders in the UK. So most people here will probably be aware that the RANZ Psychiatry, that they produced some mood disorder guidelines. And when you actually look at what we should be providing everybody, it's exercise and talking therapy. first and to everybody. So that's the first thing which we should be offering people. But we often rush in, and the NHS, who can be much more forceful about this with their guidelines, given how they're funded, they've said it is not okay that so many people are walking and getting a pill before they're offered, what we know will be most helpful for them. How many people diagnosed with schizophrenia ever get offered the now well-developed CBT for psychosis or cognitive remediation therapy? So it's not just about those with a trauma history, but we'll hinge this discussion on treating trauma. So let's break out now and consider how roles and services might look differently if we were to shift the discourse somewhat. You can consider your own roles. You could, consider if you're a consumer, service user, however you might wish to be identified, carer or supporter, just what, a therapeutic orientated service might actually look like if we're all pulling together to ensure people get the right treatment, which is psychotherapy at the right time.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. My name's Lisa Thorpe. I'm going to facilitate sort of the next half an hour or so. That was a really thought-provoking and progressive presentation. It's actually music to my ears, Richard. So thank you so much. So Richard's put up on his final slide the two questions that we're going to ask you to consider in breakout rooms. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to put everybody into breakout rooms of groups of 5 to 7 people for about 10 minutes to start off by introducing yourself, stating what your role is and how it might be reimagined if treating trauma or providing access to the right dose of the right psychotherapy at the right time was your principal concern. If you identify as a survivor of trauma or a carer of somebody, please imagine what that treatment might look like. And then to ask what would our service models look like if we were able to shift that discourse into a therapeutic one. First, the questions will be, the questions are available in the rooms, are they, Amy? Yep. So, so the questions will be available in the rooms. Or the other thing that will happen while you're in the rooms is when it's time to come back, there'll be a warning that you're going to come back. There's going to be a delay. Amy will start putting you in rooms now. There will be a delay for some of you just because there's a number of us and she has to put you manually each group into a room. So thanks very much, everybody.